Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Recording in progress. Oh my God, it was too much.
You enjoyed the last one so much, I figured I had to whip out another one. This is a Snoopy mummy, for those of you who can't see us.
I love it.
And you can see there's a theme, like it's Halloween-y, but not too scary since I'm a big chicken.
I love it. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia, and with me is, as always, my very creative co-host, Jennifer Woolman. Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Good. How are you? Haven't seen you in a while. You were off in Atlanta at C5, which
That's right.
Sounds like it was amazing. Real quick before we get started, any
Sure.
highlights or quick takeaways you want to?
It was phenomenal. It was a great idea for NAR to partner with CCIM to do the event. It was very well attended. There was a lot of great energy in the room. As always, the quality of the presentations was bar none, some of the best. I will say we had two really keynote speakers. Our opening session was with David Robinson, NBA legend, and really an amazing human being. Let's just say that he has a PhD in connecting with other human beings. And then we had FBI negotiator Chris Voss.
My hero.
I know. Finish out with the closing session, and that was just a tremendously insightful presentation on human behavior and the way that we interact with each other. And then in between, just great data on everything that is happening in the commercial market, and the future of every asset class was touched upon in one way or another. So, again, phenomenal. I'm sure we'll do an episode because it does deserve its own episode. There were a lot of...
We will definitely do its own episode. But for those of you who are listening, if you want to attend next year, it's going to be in Hollywood, Florida, at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. So book sometime in
September 14th through the 17th. In a way, Hollywood is close enough to Miami to say that we're hosting it.
We're in Miami, exactly.
So it'll be a lot of fun.
And since Miami really goes pretty much from the Florida Keys all the way up north to Martin and Indian River County in a lot of people's minds, we can easily claim Hollywood.
Miami brand just oozes into other territories and other counties throughout South Florida. So absolutely.
Ooze is definitely a word that is, goes with Halloween and the theme of Halloween and scariness. So this episode, in the last episode, we talked about how fear can stop us from doing deals and moving forward and growing our company, our wealth, or just growing in general. Yeah. And so I thought one of the things that we had said, especially in relation to public speaking and addressing your fears, is that planning really helped. The very famous line from Franklin D. Roosevelt, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," was actually inspired by Napoleon Hill, the author of Think and Grow Rich. He also wrote another book about fear. So I thought this episode we could talk about planning and how that can help us move forward, especially now, because you very insightfully stated in the last episode that, fear creates also opportunity. So instead of being held stuck by fear, let's figure out how to include planning. And I guess this idea all started too because somebody asked you last week how somebody new to investing would go about identifying investment opportunities and everything else. So do you want to dive into some of
I thought we would also go over this idea that you texted me about attacking the monster, this unknown and the fear that you have when you're putting a deal together, and, especially when you're going through due diligence and, making sure to get it through the finish line. I think we'll go over a few of those things, but I received a question through a colleague of ours about investing. And the question really was, which industries you should focus on, next year in commercial. And I gave him a little rundown of what asset classes we're seeing still holding the lead in regards to investors' attention, industrial, multifamily. I think that there is a lot of interest in the office sector here in South Florida just because of how well we're performing compared to the rest of the nation. The following question was, how can someone new to investing like me identify good opportunities in office and retail through you guys? So I just gave him a rundown, and this was the rundown. First, take care of the basics, like develop a budget. If financing is needed, identify the lenders and programs available that can yield good results. Discuss investment goals to develop an investment strategy. I think that that's very, very important because it speaks to whether you're going to be a disciplined investor that has a point of view, or if you're just going to look at everything that is on the market and go one by one and figure out if those deals make sense. Identify asset class and location based on investment strategy, and then methodically look at opportunities on and off market to determine if they fit the investment strategy, and then you execute when the opportunity matches the investment strategy. That's really the bulk of it, these 6 ideas. And what I would say is everything that has worked out in my experience with my clients, you evaluate their success based on their failures. In other words, which deals really went awry and which deals were great. And if you really look at it, those that have a very clear point of view have always consistently done well from the get-go. Right? They got in at a good basis. They had a good plan that was 7-10 years down the line. The other ones, they still did well because the property appreciated, right? Because you still own real estate and you were able to create the value that you saw fit, but it just took them longer to get there because they didn't have that approach and that perspective. And I think that is an important component of anything to do with having fear for investing. Is the real fear is not to invest. The fear is the fear of the unknown.
So what I heard were basically, even though there were a total of like 6 items that you listed, was that they mainly fall into the 3 categories, right? Which is clearly identify your goals. That includes, and that has to be very specific, right? Yeah. That includes developing a business plan, develop your budget, identify where you're going to get financing.
Right.
Then after that would come market knowledge, right? To your point of looking on and off market, try to see what things are going for, what are cap rates that are listed out there. Mm-hmm. And then under that comes property knowledge, right? Because then you're getting even more specific and you're seeing if, so you go, once you have your goals, you go from there to see if a certain market matches those goals, and then within that market, which properties match those goals. So we already talked about identifying your goals and being specific with the business plan and budgeting. How would you go about, if you're a new investor, to this person's point, if you're a new investor, how would you go about learning a market? I know we've talked a little bit about it with our PR and our conversation with Emily Line, but how would you get into really exploring a market?
Well, what I find interesting is that there's 2 sides to this. One is the technical side of the market itself, the location, and then of course the property that you're acquiring. The other side of this, it's more about the psychology of the human mind. How many times have you shown a property to a client and it's the first property they see, and you know that this is the best that they're likely to see because the deal just makes so much sense, but they can't see it because it's the first one they've seen. So there's a psychological wall that has to break down in the sense that if I see this is the first time I'm seeing it, this is good, but is this the best? Right? Can I do better? And I think that is an important component. So when I have a client who is kind of setting themselves up to invest, right? Whether they are, liquidating some assets, they know they're going to have some money. The first thing that I want them to do is to start looking at deals as soon as possible to familiarize themselves with the market. Everybody who has a point of view and they're going to invest, the more deals you see in front of you, the easier it is for you to identify when there's a great deal or a very good deal that is in front of your hands, or even a mediocre deal that you can make better because you have a different perspective on how you're going to use that property. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a big obstacle when people are starting fresh, is that they think, well, if I see a good deal, there might be a better one out there. So there's also that FOMO, missing out because I haven't seen enough. And so we have to work around that. And I think that the easiest way to overcome that is just to make sure that you see a lot of stuff. Now, we're in a market where there's not a lot of stuff to see, right? The savvy investor, the experienced investor jumps on certain deals right away because they've already seen everything else that's on the market and they understand what the value is there.
Agreed. I would also, especially if it's a market you're not familiar with, I would also subscribe to a local newspaper, here, either the Miami Herald or more specifically something like the Daily Business Journal, which is very, very good at keeping track of deals. The Real Deal, I know some people love and use that as their source. So because that also tells you not only what is transacting and who's buying or selling in the area, it also tells you what's coming down the road. So we know, if a university's expanding or a new medical center's coming in, or we're reading about all the new tech companies coming to Miami, all of a sudden that's going to give you insights on a market that maybe the deal flow itself isn't going to give you. It's giving you a bigger picture versus a bird's eye view of the market in general. So now we've done the market. So now let's say we identify a property. And so obviously, we all talk about the importance of due diligence. You and I have recently been dealing with several buildings that we're trying to lease up where there were some holes in the due diligence, and we're seeing the effects of that. So, we're not doing this month, we're not doing our circle time and our kindergarten story just because we've run out of times. But I did want to throw in a book here. It's called Who's Afraid of the Dark? And it's written by Melanie Joyce. And it's a story about a little fox and how sounds and shapes and noises in the dark are scary.
If you've been listening to this podcast at all, any of the episodes, I think it's important for me to mention what a proud grandmother Jennifer Woolman is, right? And please understand, it's not like she's going home to an empty house with her husband just reading children's books, okay? I want to understand, there are some beautiful human beings in your life that have, I think, reconnected you with all of these stories. I just wanted to put that out there.
It's totally true, and I'm reliving those. But full disclosure, I have a huge collection of children's books and Disney movies that I have on Betamax, from before I had children, because
and also plush dolls that make music.
True. Well, those I'll pass on to my granddaughter for sure. Those are because she loves playing with those, and she's like me. She likes scary, but not really.
Well, now back to the show.
So in this book, the narrator is letting the fox know that the dark is full of things that creak and croak and moan, things that jump, things that go bump, and things that grumble and groan. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if that doesn't describe a real estate deal and the importance of due diligence, I don't know what does. For me, it's definitely, once you get a property under contract, really digging in and do the due diligence. Really, some people try to do it before they get the property under contract, which I think is a huge mistake because they either lose it or they talk themselves out of it through fear. But once they're in it, they kind of once they're under contract, they kind of already have skin in the game, and then they can really do a deep dive. So what are some of the things during due diligence? What are some of your top things to look at other than do they, obviously, do they meet your goals and financial requirements and everything else.
So I find interestingly, think back to your first commercial deal and when you were putting that together and the contract is, you don't know what you don't know. Therefore, the list of things to look out for is much, much shorter, right? Because you're focusing on the contract, making sure everybody is in accordance. Oftentimes, the negotiation of the price is not the most asked part of the negotiation. It's all the rest of the terms that are incredibly important for the value of the transaction. And so I think that list with experience grows larger and larger and larger, and you start to anticipate what are potential issues that this deal can have down the road, and you learn that it is better to address those early and maybe even before you get into contract. But you're in contract, you have a due diligence period, use it wisely. You want to make sure that obviously the quality of the property is going to be an important component of this process. You also want to, if you're buying a significant amount of land, you want to look at any environmental concerns that you might have with that land, especially if your plan is to develop it in the future or to redevelop that site for commerce. And so I think that those things are incredibly important. And then there are things that people don't necessarily appreciate, which is things that kind of creep up at the end of transactions, like a survey that has encroachments and things of the like. But before getting into that, because I do have a couple stories, tell me a little bit about your approach in due diligence.
So for the property, obviously, just depending on what the property use is, all the things that are in the contract that you think of, right? First off is the survey. Then you want to get all the rent, all the leases, if there are any leases. You want to get service contracts, et cetera. And what I find super interesting is, especially for the investors that buy value add, a lot of times, and I just did this deal last year, there were no formal leases. And when I asked for the financials, I literally got copies on my phone where the landlord took pictures of the rent checks.
Right.
And sent them to me, and those were the financials. So those deals take a much deeper dive and require a lot more due diligence because the information just isn't there. So if you're sellers who operate that way, let me just tell you right now, before you list your property, do yourself a favor and have the basics together. And even if it's an informal rent roll or it's a tax return or it's some kind of lease, even if they're on month to month, something that shows a potential buyer what they're actually buying beyond the scope of the building. Again, if you're a seller in Florida, we have 40-year certifications, now 30-year certifications, and 10-year certifications after the original one. So make sure they're those. And then to your point about the environmental, I think the environmental applies even if it's not land. So in the book that I was talking about the scared little fox and being afraid of the dark, it actually says about, taking a look back. It says, if you go into the dark, always remember to look behind, because lurking in the shadows, who knows what you might find. And I think about places that used to be, even in retail, right? In a retail shopping center, it might currently be a food, restaurant or takeaway or a CVS or something, but maybe before it was a dry cleaner.
Right.
And those, different uses in the past, before chemicals were banned or changed or laws were changed, things were discarded that even if it was 50, 60 years ago, they don't break down, they don't go away, and that can still be an issue for a new owner. And it's not so readily available, right? So sometimes in due diligence, to that example, you have to say, okay, great, I see what's there now, but what was in this shopping center for the last 10 years? See if there's a way to go back and get a record of, was there ever a dry cleaner there? Was that warehouse ever a paint booth or mechanic repair shop? Because those issues are accepted by the new owner, and the risk becomes the new owner's responsibility for cleanup and everything else. So for me, the environmental is a biggie, kind of regardless of asset class, and at least doing a historical search.
I had a colleague of mine that was working on a piece of land that was residential in its current state, but this property was behind a small strip center. Immediately behind that, one of the stores that was immediately, abutting the piece of land that they were acquiring was a dry cleaner. So then that immediately triggered a phase 2 environmental, and then they found that there was contamination from the dry cleaner through basically going underneath this asphalt, right, of parking into his property, or potentially his purchase, the property he was going to purchase. And so, of course, at that point, it's the question of, okay, what is the procedure for remediation? What is the cost? And then go back to the renegotiation table that he really wanted the property. I'll tell you, that is the last thing he thought, that the environmental was going to be an issue. He thought, I'll do a phase 1. Nothing has ever been built on this piece of land. It's only 15,000 square feet. I want it for myself. It shouldn't be an issue. He never thought that the shopping center behind would be a cause of concern. Right. And then this is a surprise, but it's better to find that early, right? And then you can plan for it, and you go back and retrade it. And when it comes to environmental, what a lot of people don't understand is that in a lot of ways, everything is buyer beware, right? But when it comes to environmental, it's buyer and seller beware, right? It behooves all the parties to be aware of what is happening there. So that's an important thing that a lot of people don't understand. You could have clawbacks and come back when you have environmental issues on a property. So it's important for you to know what you own and what condition it's in.
Well, and to your point, so in that example, that we still have a lot of residential and commercial properties in Miami that are on septic and well water. So in that example with dry cleaning, the groundwater can be contaminated. And what does that mean if you're buying that property and the water that you're going to be using in your factory or whatever has this chemical in it, which, heated becomes airborne, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. Environmental's a big one.
Were there things that snuck up on you when you first started doing transactions that now you look for in advance?
I'm trying to think, since most of the stuff when I first started selling was owner-user, right. I don't think so much, because since I'm paranoid and afraid of all the unknowns, I was, I would dig deep, but I knew what the use was. Getting into investment properties, I still think there's stuff that's come up that I haven't seen yet. Right. One of the things that we've harped on a couple of times is really doing a deep dive during your due diligence in terms of, if there are tenants in the building, are they all allowed uses? Because going back to our point of the retail, if you have a strip mall that has a bunch of different uses within that strip mall, but they might not have a CU, or that use might not actually be approved based on zoning. Right. As soon as you buy that and it triggers something in the county or the city, all of a sudden you could be losing tenants. So that was one thing. And then the other thing that we keep going back to is parking. Make sure that in your goal, so if your goal is to buy an empty office building, since that's all anyone's talking about these days, and converting it to medical office, because there's a lot of medical in your area, and you see that the hospitals are expanding and everything else, is the parking, even though you might think that the numbers are going to meet your goals because you're looking at, okay, well, right now the building's empty, but I can get this much for medical office in my area. You might look at the parking, and because the office is vacant, it looks like there's a ton of parking, right? There's not a lot of cars. I can always park easily, but if you go to medical, especially to some uses that are very, very high demand in medical for parking, you can take a building that looks great on paper and all of a sudden parking becomes a huge issue and you're not going to be able to get the rents, or you're not going to be able to get the tenants, or it's going to take you a lot longer, or you're going to have to come up with creative parking methods. So I think those are the two big things that you don't really get into as an owner user. You don't need to dig as deep because you're using the building. You know how many employees you have. You know what your parking is going to be. You don't need to look at who's leasing the building and whether or not the use is approved. So other than if it's going to be approved for your use. But yeah, with investors, I think the due diligence becomes a little bit more, well, it does become a lot more intense because it's all about the numbers, right? Whereas as an owner user, it's the numbers, yes, but it's more about how you're going to use the space and what it's going to do for your business.
Well, you reminded me of something which I think is important, that just because a property looks to be one thing, it doesn't mean that is its current legal use. Right. And so I remember selling a warehouse right by the Miami River. It looks like a warehouse. It was built as a warehouse. It was being utilized as a warehouse. It has never been anything other than a warehouse. The reason why I was hired is because the sellers found out that they were trying to lease it and the tenant couldn't get a certificate of use for the property as its intended purpose. The building is a warehouse. It was built to be a warehouse. However, here's what happened. City of Miami changed the zoning code. They go from the 1100 old code to Miami 21. This zoning was upzoned. It became T5, which is a mixed use, right? You could have retail, you could have, and you could do multifamily. You could build on that. I think that she would have been able to build a really nice mixed use building. There was a tenant in place there. The tenant had a certificate of use. As long as that certificate of use is active, right, the old use of the certificate of use to occupy it as a warehouse, they would have been able to keep going for years and years and years, as long as you don't let it lapse for more than a year. Tenant was not renewing the certificate of use. Landlord was not checking to make sure that the tenant was renewing the certificate of use. Certificate of use lapses for 2 years. So now you can no longer use it for that purpose because now you are no longer grandfathered in. So even though it looks like a warehouse, right, and it functions as a warehouse, you cannot legally use it as a warehouse.
Which means you can't sell it as a warehouse or buy it as a warehouse.
Correct.
Yeah.
So now that brings an entire set of choices. One of them is to ask for a warrant from the city to change it back and basically ask for an exemption, and all of those things take time, energy, effort, and all other stuff. The other thing is to say, okay, I'm gonna use it for what I'm able to use it for, and then develop it in the future. I think there was a combination of those two factors that was brought in, and basically it became retail, right? Because that was a legal use,
allowed use,
and then they just
warehouse space,
right. But it took the buyer a little more than a year to really stabilize the property, which is crazy. But that is a component that is very important. People say, well, are there open permits? Are they, do we have any liens on the property? Okay, no open permits, no liens, I'm good to go. But they don't check the certificate of use. They don't check the zoning. They don't check to make sure that...
Well, they did check the zoning. It's just that the new zoning wasn't the same as the old zoning. So that goes back to, that's something else that you have to look at the historical record for that property so that you can determine, because to your point, just because it looks like, feels like, sounds like, quacks like a warehouse doesn't mean it is a warehouse anymore.
But some people don't look at the zoning, right? They're thinking as long as it doesn't have open permits and as long as it doesn't have liens, then I'm getting clean title, then I'm good to go, and they don't check that the zoning either has changed or evolved, or maybe it wasn't being used the right way.
Right. There's some other things that you need to look at that are similar, where you have to look backwards to see if additional paperwork is needed. One was the story that you told about the environmental with the land going underneath it, and it was like, oh, well, that road's always going to be there. Another one can be grease traps, right? So you can have a grease trap that is grandfathered in as long as all of the correct paperwork is continuously filled out. But if somebody leaves that restaurant space or that commissary kitchen or that bar or coffee shop and grease traps are no longer allowed there. And to your point, the paperwork trail dies, then all of a sudden it's not grandfathered in anymore. So even though you're either leasing or buying a space with a grease trap, and they're right, it does have a grease trap, but guess what? You can't use that anymore. Then all of a sudden you're already in a lease or under contract and you can't use that. So that's another thing to look out for.
And I'm going to double check, but it is my understanding that Miami-Dade County is creating a disclosure when you're selling a restaurant, that you're providing a disclosure that is being created or already has been created by Miami-Dade County from seller to buyer, to basically say this is what it is, because I guess they kept getting, well, they told me that I could do this, they told me that I could do that. And,
right. You know, and the same is true with the septic tank. So I know that we have disclosures for residential here, but I think if you're a commercial property owner, just because you might be buying old residential land that might have an old septic on it, you would want to know that, right? Yeah. You would want to know that there's a septic tank there before you start digging that might need to be pulled out and redone, or can you hook up to sewer?
Can I tell you a quick story about a survey? Because you were talking about planning and about where experience comes into play sometimes. And I have a client, we're selling his property. He inherited the property from his father. He knew the property very well. He certainly knew the property very well. But we are doing a showing, and in the middle of the showing, my client decides to make a comment that he hadn't made to me, which is that, no, I think that there's an encroachment here of about 15 feet on the property, right? But I don't know because I don't have a survey. But I remember my dad telling this story about him and the neighbor, about the encroachment and all of that stuff. I kept that in my mind, right? Now we get an offer of the property. We get a full price offer on the property. I know that most of the time buyers are going to do their survey right at the end, right? Which I think it's not a good idea. I think you should do the survey right away. But in this case, they weren't planning on doing the survey early. So I know that when that comes up, it's usually 9th hour, right? 2 days before closing, hey, we have a problem with the survey, and now we have to retrade, or we have to have this conversation, or this has to be fixed, or whatever it is. I tell my client and his attorney, you need to put language in this contract that says that you are not sure if there is an encroachment, but if there is an encroachment, that they're going to take the property the way it is. They're going to have their due diligence period. They could do their own survey, and they could find out if it's something they could live with, but you want to have this clarity. My client was fighting with me because he thought that by putting that we were going to mess up the deal. I said, listen, if it messes up the deal, better to mess up the deal now.
Right, in the front of the deal instead of at the end of the deal.
When I saw other people that are interested and you have competition, than for you to do it when it's the 9th hour and you're going to feel you're already counting your money, so you're going to feel compelled.
Or you've already spent
it. Right, or if you've already spent it. And even the attorney was like, why do you find this necessary? I said, because I've been around. He doesn't know. They've owned the property for 30 years. He's not aware. There's no survey. So either do a survey or put this in the language. So of course it did come back and there was an encroachment. And the buyers, because you told them early.
Because they knew up front that there potentially could.
And that's what happens at a lot of times when we have conversations with sellers. Sometimes sellers are apprehensive to share something. In my experience, the way I look at this is, and this is so appropriate because we're talking about fear. Mm-hmm. Fear, there's only two things. It's fight or flight, right? And you either face it, right? Or you're going to run away from it for the rest of your life.
Right.
And I think that what happens is most buyers are willing to accept a lot of things as long as you inform them early before they make the decision. But once they have all the information and they move forward, they're comfortable with that decision because they don't feel like there's surprises.
Right, the seed's already been planted it's a good.
Like, this is what I miss. And also they feel so much more comfortable because they feel like you've shared everything you know. So I feel more comfortable about the purchase because you told me the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it is what it is. And then you only need one buyer.
Right.
That one buyer is going to take it the way it is, and it just makes all the sense in the world.
You know that Spanish saying, "En guerra avisada no muere gente," which basically means in an advertised war, people don't die because they, So it's kind of the same thing, right?
Because they know what's going to happen, what's going on.
Right.
Exactly.
And they wouldn't have lost anything if they get the survey back and there's no encroachment. It was just a story that he had heard. He thought he'd repeat it. There's no potential lawsuit. Like, by you doing that without the seller realizing it, you took a lot of the fear out of that seller, because if you hadn't put that in there, my guess is once it went hard and you had already said, we should do this, because if he had chosen not to, he'd be going, oh my God, what's going to happen?
Correct.
What if he wasn't going to sleep until it closes or until the survey's done, and then it blows up, and now he's worried for it for the whole length of the time that the property's under contract. And he gets bad faith on the buyer side because they feel like he hid something, because he could be like, well, my dad said there was one. I heard a story, but I don't remember. Then all of a sudden there's bad faith, and he was trying to pull a fast one.
I have another tip for sellers. So this is also a Miami River property. Seawall was down, right? And the deck was a mess. It was so concerning. I didn't want anybody to walk over it because, they could hurt themselves. We're putting the property on the market. My client is, we're going to sell it as is. It is what it is. So then I say, do a seawall inspection, pay for the inspection, and get a quote. Do it in advance. I know it's going to cost you a little bit of money, but it's going to serve you well in the future, because people are going to throw crazy numbers to tell you that they're giving you this lowball offer because they got to spend all this money. And you really want to know what's going on. And the more we do, it was so much fun, because, these guys come in a boat, they get in the scuba gear, they get under there, they start evaluating, they take underwater pictures. It was a cool experience. I don't deal with seawalls all the time,
right.
So it's great. But can I tell you how important that was? Some sellers believe, well, let them find out, and whatever they find out, I'll address it. I find, especially with something like that, you don't want to be behind the 8 ball. The more information you have, again, overcoming that fear, the more information you have, the better suited you are to overcome any obstacle that comes your way from the moment you get into contract to the moment that you close that transaction. And information is power, right?
Right.
And so overcoming that comes with, an investment, no doubt about it, but it served them so well, because the numbers that everybody was throwing at us was 3 times the amount that we knew. And then we said, look, we have a report, we have this, the guys came in scuba gear, here are the pictures.
Right. If you want to get your own inspection and you want to get your own quote, fine, but at least you had a starting point, and your seller didn't freak out going, oh my gosh, this guy's trying to rob me blind, and the buyer wasn't freaking out saying like, oh no, what if the whole the what ifs, what if the whole seawall collapses? What if I get in there and they don't give me the, So, the point of being prepared. So it's not just being prepared as a buyer, be prepared as a seller.
Furthermore, with that report, the buyers that were getting crazy numbers were able to take that report, give it to the person that was giving the numbers, and they got better numbers, because now the person that was giving them the quote, right, the seawall contractor can see exactly what he needed to do. They can see the report.
They don't have to guess at what might be under there, given their experience and the nightmares that they've run into trying to repair seawalls and everything else. Exactly. I think we're ready. For the fun fact. Sometimes we go long, sometimes we go short.
I love it. Well, look, I think the lesson here, and I'm sure the lesson of the book as well, is you don't have to be afraid. You just have to be prepared, right? You have to
be prepared, and you have to look at what's scaring you. So it's always like, it sounds scary in the dark, but when you finally go and find out what it is, rustling in the bushes, it's a badger or, nothing scary.
Right.
So, yeah.
I got you.
As soon as everything comes to light through preparation, then those fears can go away. So what's your stat? I see you
Well, no, I just wanted to say, because I was curious about this, especially on the environmental side. I was wondering if I could actually find this data, but there is actual data on this. There are over 300,000 environmental site assessments that are completed in the United States every year.
Wow.
So that's I don't know. What did you think? Were you thinking that number would be higher, lower? Think about it. Most residential transactions don't have an environmental site assessment. So, and not every commercial transaction is going to have an ESA.
I would be curious to see if that's so. Is that all together, or is that just phase 1, or is that just phase?
Okay, those are only phase 1.
Okay, right. So then that.
So not everything would trigger a phase 2.
Right. Yeah. So if that's a phase 1, it makes sense to me. If that's a phase 2, I would be surprised by how high it is. Correct. Because again, the phase 1 is doing the historical look back. Is there anything here that requires a deeper look? Oh, I'm glad you looked at. That's a great stat. You didn't. you must have known you were going to bring up an environmental issue as something to be potentially scared of.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Okay, so you're probably going to be wondering why I'm choosing the stat that I'm in, because it's about cruising. And the reason for my cruise stat is because the peak season for cruising out of Miami is from December to April. So to avoid crowds and high prices, cruisebooking.com recommends that one of the best months to cruise from Miami is October. And we're in October, so hurry up and book those cruises.
That's the best month to get a good deal?
It's one of the top. It was, I believe it was May, September, and October, but I just focus on October because that's when the...
Jessica, let's go. Set it up for the whole family.
And then the basically, this is because we toured Port Miami, which is going to be another episode, was Port Miami was on track to exceed 7 million cruise passengers before the pandemic. In 2019, they had 6,824,000 passengers go through Port Miami. And I'm super curious as to what this year is going to look like, because they had their busiest day ever in the history of Port Miami for cruise passengers. It was April 9th of this year, and they had 67,594 passengers go through their port.
Wow. Well, listen, that's a great stat, but I was in the room when you received that information, so technically you can't claim that as your stat, but I will allow it.
I'm the one who pulled it up. You saw me hiding the Port Miami thing. But the cruise industry is super, super big. Wherever there's a port in Miami, it generated $7 billion and 40,000 jobs per year from things like ground and air transportation, F&B, hotel stays, all the stuff that you need before and after, before you get on the ship and afterwards.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you for pulling up a chair and joining us in another episode of Between Two Chairs. Be sure to follow us on RSS feed, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to fine podcasts, such as this one.
And if you get any value out of it or know somebody who would, please feel free to share. I can't believe we did that shameless plug.
I know, I love it. Well, it's the first one in a bunch, so why not? Bye, everybody.